Damian Lancaster adjusted the cuff of his tailored black suit, his sharp blue eyes scanning the opulent ballroom with disinterest. He had no desire to be here. Charity events were just another obligation in the world of the wealthy, a place where people in designer gowns made generous donations more for the prestige than the cause. He had written a check large enough to make an impact, but attending in person, that had been his assistant's idea. "You need to be seen, Mr. Lancaster," she had insisted. "Your reputation could use a softer touch." So here he was, swirling a glass of whiskey, waiting for the night to pass. He had built his empire from the ground up, turning a single investment into a multi-million-dollar real estate empire. He wasn't interested in social games or pretending to care about causes that people only supported for PR purposes. Then a voice broke through the chatter of the room. "Good evening, everyone. I want to personally thank you for being here tonight." Damian turned toward the stage, and for the first time that evening, someone caught his attention. She stood at the podium, poised yet passionate, her dark brown hair swept into an elegant updo. The deep emerald gown she wore was simple but stunning, hugging her figure perfectly. But it wasn't just her beauty that captivated him, it was the fire in her eyes, the sincerity in her voice. "My name is Selene Hawthorne," she continued, her voice clear and steady. "Founded this organization because I believe in change and action. Tonight, every dollar you donate will go directly toward providing shelter, education, and opportunities to those who need it most. This isn't just about charity, it's about changing lives." The room applauded politely, but Damian found himself rooted to the spot, watching her. There was something different about her, something real. Unlike the other socialites who ran charities as a side project, Selene believed in this cause with her whole heart. He had never been interested in women from this world. They were too caught up in their image, too concerned with status. But Selene, she was different. And he wanted to know why. As the night went on, Damian stayed on the sidelines observing her. She moved through the crowd with grace, speaking to donors, laughing warmly with guests. The way she carried herself, confident yet approachable, only intrigued him more. "Are you going to stand there all night, or are you actually going to introduce yourself?" Damian turned to see his friend Oliver Grant, watching him with amusement. "Who is she?" Damian asked, ignoring the teasing tone in Oliver's voice. "Selene Hawthorne, she's the real deal, built this charity from the ground up. She's been running it without taking a single cent for herself." Damian raised an eyebrow. "She doesn't take a salary." Oliver shook his head. "Nope. Lives modestly, invests everything back into the cause. You don't meet many people like her in our world, Damian." Damian's grip tightened around his glass. That only made her more fascinating. Without another word, he strode toward her. Selene had just finished a conversation with an older couple when she turned, nearly colliding with him. "Whoa," she said, laughing softly, "didn't see you there." Up close, she was even more breathtaking. Her hazel eyes held an intensity that caught him off guard. "I'm Damian Lancaster," he said, his voice smoother than he expected. Her lips parted slightly, recognition flashing in her eyes. Ah, the Damian Lancaster, the real estate mogul. He tilted his head. "You say that like it's a bad thing." She shrugged playfully. "Not bad, just different. We don't see many business tycoons at events like this. Yet here I am." She smiled. "And why is that?" He could have given a rehearsed answer, something about supporting good causes, but instead he found himself saying the truth. "I wanted to meet you." Selene blinked, her expression unreadable for a moment, then slowly she smiled. "Well, Mr. Lancaster, I hope you didn't come expecting a business deal. I don't do mergers." He chuckled, charmed by her wit. "No mergers, just conversation." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "All right, Mr. Lancaster, let's see if you can keep up." And with that, she turned, walking toward the dance floor. Damian watched her go, a rare grin tugging at his lips. For the first time in a long time, he was intrigued. The music swirled around them as Damian followed Selene onto the dance floor, the soft glow of the chandeliers casting a golden hue over the room. She moved with effortless grace, her posture poised yet relaxed, as if she belonged to this world of elegance and refinement while simultaneously standing apart from it. He extended a hand, and she accepted without hesitation, her fingers cool yet steady against his. As they began to move in sync with the slow rhythm of the music, he noted the way she held herself not like someone trying to impress but like someone who had nothing to prove. "So, Mr. Lancaster," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of amusement, "tell me what exactly made you want to meet me?" He could have given an answer that played into charm or mystery, but something about her made him unwilling to waste time on games. "You're different." Selene tilted her head slightly, arching a brow. "That's a vague observation." He allowed himself a small, genuine smile. "It's a simple one. You believe in what you're doing. Most people in this room are here for appearances. You're here because it matters to you." Her expression softened, though her eyes remained searching, as if she were trying to determine whether he was genuine or simply skilled at playing the part. "I take it you don't believe in charity events then?" "I believe in results," he countered. "People write checks, pose for pictures, and go home feeling good about themselves. But how much of it actually makes a difference?" Selene's lips pressed together, and for a moment he thought he might have said something that put distance between them. But then she let out a quiet breath, her grip on his shoulder tightening slightly. "You're not entirely wrong," she admitted. "I've fought to make sure every cent that comes in actually goes where it's needed. It's not easy." He studied her closely, "And yet you keep going." "Because if I don't, who will?" That answer, simple yet filled with conviction, struck something deep within him. He was a man who built things, businesses, investments, skyscrapers, but here was a woman who was building something entirely different. Not for profit, not for power, but because she believed she had to. The song came to an end, but neither of them stepped away immediately. The energy between them had shifted, something unspoken lingering in the air. Before either could say anything further, a man in a crisp navy suit approached, clearing his throat. "Selene, may I steal you for a moment?" Damian recognized him immediately. Nathan Caldwell, heir to one of the oldest banking families in the city. He was the kind of man who had never known struggle, who moved through life with the certainty that everything would always be within his reach. Selene hesitated only briefly before giving Damian a small nod. "Excuse me." He watched as she stepped away with Nathan, their conversation low but familiar. Something about the way Caldwell leaned in slightly, the way he spoke with an air of expectation, set Damian's teeth on edge. He had no claim to Selene, he had just met her, but the idea of her caught up with someone like Caldwell left an unpleasant taste in his mouth. He turned toward the bar, ordering another drink as he observed the exchange from a distance. Selene didn't look particularly pleased, though she kept her expression neutral. Eventually, she offered a polite smile, said something that made Caldwell frown, and turned away. The moment she walked back toward him, Damian could see the tension in her shoulders. "Everything all right?" he asked, keeping his tone casual. She exhaled sharply, shaking her head. "Nathan seems to think I should be grateful for his generous offer to take over a portion of my organization's funding. Of course, his generosity comes with the expectation that he'll also get to dictate how things are run." Damian wasn't surprised. Men like Caldwell excelled at disguising control as charity. Let me guess, he framed it as a partnership. "Something like that," she muttered, taking a glass of champagne from a passing waiter but barely sipping it. He considered his next words carefully. He had no intention of overstepping, but something about the idea of her struggling against men like Caldwell irritated him. "Have you considered other funding sources?" Selene shot him a wry look. "You mean aside from the people who want a say in everything I do?" "I mean people who actually care about the cause, not their own influence." Her expression shifted slightly, curiosity flickering behind her eyes. "Are you offering Mr. Lancaster?" He took a slow sip of his drink before answering. "I don't write checks just for the sake of it, but if you can show me how it actually makes a difference, I might be interested." Selene studied him for a long moment before nodding. "All right, Mr. Lancaster, if you're serious, come by the shelter tomorrow morning, 7 a.m. His brows lifted slightly. "That early?" She grinned. "You wanted proof, didn't you?" He found himself chuckling, something rare for him. "I'll be there." Selene gave him one last searching glance before turning to rejoin the crowd. Damian remained at the bar, watching her as she moved with purpose, engaging with guests, ensuring the night's success. He hadn't come here looking for anything more than an obligatory appearance. And yet somehow, he was already in deeper than he intended. Damian arrived at the shelter just before sunrise, stepping out of his sleek black car onto the cracked pavement. The building wasn't impressive, modest brickwork, an aging sign above the entrance, and a few volunteers already moving inside. This wasn't the kind of place his usual business dealings took him to, but there was something about her that made him show up anyway. Selene emerged from the side entrance, tying her hair back as she balanced a stack of papers in one hand. She spotted him, her lips pressing together briefly before she approached. "You actually came," she said, her tone carrying more surprise than skepticism. He glanced around at the activity taking place. "I gave you my word." She motioned for him to follow, and he stepped inside. The interior was clean but well-worn, the air filled with the scent of fresh coffee and something cooking in the back. A few people sat at tables, some eating, others simply resting. Volunteers moved efficiently, setting up for what looked like a community breakfast. Selene didn't waste time with pleasantries. "If you want to see how this place runs, you'll have to do more than stand around looking important." She handed him a clipboard. "We're short on hands today. Can you manage food distribution?" Damian studied the clipboard. He could negotiate billion-dollar deals, but he hadn't served food since his college years. He wasn't about to back down. "Where do you need me?" She led him to a long table where trays of scrambled eggs, fruit, and toast were being arranged. As he rolled up his sleeves, she moved beside him, effortlessly shifting between tasks. It was clear she had done this countless times, that she wasn't just the face of the organization, she was its backbone. For the next hour, he worked alongside her, handing out plates, exchanging brief words with the people who came through. Some were reserved, others openly grateful. He noticed the way Selene interacted with each person, knowing their names, asking about their lives. At one point, a young girl no older than 10 hesitated in front of the table, glancing up at Selene. "Morning, Maya," Selene greeted warmly. "How's school?" The girl smiled shyly. "Good, I got a gold star on my reading test." "That's amazing," Selene praised. "I knew you could do it." The girl beamed before taking her plate and hurrying off. Damian watched the exchange, something settling in his chest. "You remember all their names," he noted. Selene continued filling plates. "They're not just numbers on a spreadsheet, they're people." Something about the way she said it made him quiet for a moment. By the time the breakfast rush ended, Damian had seen enough to understand this wasn't just a charity. It was a lifeline. Selene wiped down a counter before turning to him. "So, Mr. Lancaster, did this give you the proof you needed?" He met her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "It gave me perspective." She studied him for a moment before nodding. "That's a start." As she turned to speak with another volunteer, Damian realized something unsettling. He had come here to evaluate the organization. Instead, he found himself drawn further into her world. Damian didn't leave after the breakfast rush. He could have, his schedule was packed, deals waiting, meetings scheduled, but something about this place, about her, kept him anchored. Selene moved through the shelter with purpose, briefing volunteers, checking on supplies, and speaking with the people who relied on the place for safety. Every time she passed him, her eyes would flick to his, as if she were surprised he was still there. Finally, after another hour, she found him near a stack of donation boxes. "I expected you to disappear the second breakfast was over," she admitted, tilting her head slightly. He leaned against the wall, watching her. "And disappoint you, never." She huffed a quiet laugh, but there was something softer in her expression now. "You're full of surprises, Lancaster." "I think you are too," he countered. "I've met a lot of people who claim they want to change the world. You're the first I've met who's actually doing it." Her gaze flickered with something unreadable, as if she wasn't sure how to take the compliment. Instead of responding, she motioned toward the door. "Come with me." He followed her outside. where the sun had fully risen, casting golden light over the modest courtyard. A group of kids played with an old soccer ball, their laughter filling the air. Selene leaned against the low fence, watching them with a quiet intensity. "This place exists because I refuse to let it fail," she said finally. "I've had people try to take control, pull funding, tell me it's not sustainable, but I made a promise that I wouldn't let these people be forgotten." There was a weight behind her words, something deeper than just passion. "And yet you're still fighting for every dollar," Damian observed. She glanced at him. "It's not about money, it's about control. The second I let someone else dictate how this place is run, it stops being about the people and starts being about power." He understood that all too well. The business world was filled with people who wanted control disguised as generosity. He exhaled, looking at her fully. "So what if I make an offer with no strings attached?" Selene turned to face him fully now, her eyes narrowing slightly. "You don't seem like the kind of man who does things without expecting something in return." He held her gaze. "Maybe I just want to see what happens when someone like you doesn't have to fight so hard for once." For a moment she didn't say anything, then slowly her expression shifted, something unreadable passing through her features. "I don't want a charity case, Damian." "This wouldn't be charity," he said, voice firm. "It would be an investment in something that actually matters." Selene studied him, the guarded look still there, but something else, too, something unsure. Before she could respond, one of the kids called her name, waving eagerly. She turned, her entire posture softening as she waved back. Damian watched, something shifting in his chest. He had walked into that ballroom expecting nothing. Now, standing here, watching her fight for something bigger than herself, he realized he wanted more than just a passing intrigue. He wanted her. And he wasn't a man who walked away from something he wanted. The weight of Damian's offer hung between them, unspoken yet charged with meaning. Selene wasn't the type to accept help easily. He could see it in the way she squared her shoulders, her mind already working through the implications. But he also saw something else: exhaustion, a woman who had spent years fighting battles alone. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she turned back to the shelter, her gaze flicking over the building, the people inside, the life she had built brick by brick. He followed her lead, waiting. He wasn't a man who rushed decisions, and he wouldn't start now. Finally, she inhaled deeply. "I need time to think about it." That was more than he had expected. He nodded once. "Take all the time you need." A flicker of relief crossed her face, but she masked it quickly. "I should get back inside." He could have let her go, walked away and left it at that. But something about her, her drive, her fire, the way she challenged him in ways no one else did, kept him rooted to the spot. "Have dinner with me," he said, the words out before he could second-guess them. Selene turned to face him fully, a mixture of surprise and something unreadable in her eyes. "Damian." "No expectations," he interrupted smoothly. "No business talk, just dinner." She exhaled, considering him for a long moment before finally she nodded. "All right, one dinner." A slow satisfaction settled in his chest. "I'll pick you up at 7. Damian wasn't the kind of man who did things halfway. When he set his mind to something, he ensured it was done to perfection. So when he picked Selene up that evening, it wasn't in a flashy display of excess, but in a way that suited her. The restaurant he chose was intimate but elegant, with dim lighting and a quiet atmosphere that allowed for conversation. No paparazzi, no distractions, just them. Selene arrived in a navy dress that wasn't overly extravagant, but it suited her, simple, timeless, effortlessly striking. As they were seated, she glanced around the space, then back at him. "I expected something more extravagant," she admitted, amusement lacing her tone. He met her gaze evenly. "I wanted somewhere we could actually talk." She tilted her head slightly. "So this isn't just a business dinner then?" He poured her a glass of wine before answering, "No." Something in her expression shifted, but she didn't press further. As the evening unfolded, the guardedness she had worn earlier began to ease. They talked not about deals or funding, but about things that mattered. She told him about how she had started the shelter, the struggles of keeping it afloat, the moments that made it all worth it. In return, he shared pieces of himself that few people ever got to see, the risks he had taken to get where he was, the sacrifices no one talked about. At one point, she laughed an unguarded, genuine sound, and Damian found himself gripping his wine glass a little tighter. He had been with beautiful women before. He had wined and dined socialites, models, women who knew the game of high society. But none of them had ever made him feel this pull, this need to know more. As the night stretched on, he realized something unsettling. This wasn't just intrigue anymore. This was something deeper, something dangerous. And for the first time in years, he wasn't sure what to do about it. As the evening at the restaurant continued, Damian found himself watching Selene with an unfamiliar sense of fascination. She was unlike anyone he had ever met, strong-willed, passionate, yet completely unaware of the effect she had on him. She wasn't trying to impress him, and that, more than anything, drew him in further. The waiter cleared their plates, and the conversation lulled just enough for Damian to study her in the warm candlelight. Her expression was relaxed now, her earlier wariness gone. But there was something else in her eyes, a quiet hesitation, as if she weren't sure what to do with this moment between them. Damian had been in control of every aspect of his life for as long as he could remember. Business, relationships, power, he dictated the terms. But with Selene, he found himself in unfamiliar territory. He didn't just want to win her over, he wanted to understand her. He reached for his glass, running a thumb along the rim before speaking. "You keep people at a distance." She blinked at the sudden shift, her fingers pausing around the stem of her wine glass. "That's direct. I don't like wasting time." Selene exhaled, setting her glass down. "It's not about distance, it's about priorities." He tilted his head slightly, waiting for her to continue. She hesitated, then finally said, "My work comes first, always has. I've seen what happens when you let emotions cloud your judgment, when you start making decisions based on feelings instead of what's right." Something flickered in her expression that told him this wasn't just about the shelter. She had learned that lesson the hard way. Damian leaned back in his chair, measuring his words. "You think emotions make you weak." "I think they make things complicated," she corrected. He considered that, "and yet you care more than anyone I've ever met." A small, almost imperceptible shift in her posture betrayed her reaction. She wasn't used to being seen this clearly. Before she could respond, the waiter returned with the check. Damian didn't even glance at it before sliding his card onto the tray. Selene watched him with an amused glint in her eyes. "You didn't even look at the total." "I don't need to." She shook her head lightly, but there was no judgment in her expression this time, just quiet observation. As they stepped outside, the city stretched before them, lights reflecting off the wet pavement from an earlier rain. Damian turned to her, resisting the urge to reach for her hand. He wasn't sure where the night had left them, but he knew one thing: he wasn't done with her, not even close. Selene glanced up at him, her breath visible in the cool night air. "I should go." He nodded but didn't move, neither did she. For a long moment, neither spoke. The air between them was thick, heavy with something unspoken. Then finally, she turned toward the waiting car that had been arranged for her, pausing just before opening the door. "Good night, Damian." His jaw tightened slightly as he watched her go, something unfamiliar settling deep in his chest. This wasn't over. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure if he wanted it to be.